Imagine a life dictated not by the precise tick of a clock, but by the relentless march of the sun across the sky, from its earliest glow to its final fading light. Imagine a life not driven by ambition, dreams of wealth, or personal fulfillment, but by the most primal, unyielding force known to humanity: survival. This is the untold story of the vast majority of people who lived in medieval Europe, the humble peasants whose toil built kingdoms and sustained entire societies, yet whose individual lives remain largely unseen, their very existence often overlooked by the grand narratives of history. Their names are lost to time, their faces forgotten, but their struggles, their extraordinary resilience, and their profound, inescapable connection to the earth echo through the ages. Their daily grind laid the foundations for the world we know today. Before we fully step back in time, into a world so profoundly different from our own, I invite you to tell us in the comments below. When and where are you listening from today? We'd love to hear from you, to connect our modern moment with the ancient echoes we are about to explore. What was it truly like to inhabit a world where every single sunrise brought with it the same relentless back-breaking demands, and every sunset ushered in a profound, unsettling uncertainty? Picture a life where every mouthful of food, every single bite, was a hard-won victory against a perpetually hungry world, and where the turning of each season represented a high-stakes gamble for existence itself. This was not merely a way of life. It was an enduring, often desperate, dance with the forces of nature and the demands of society. For centuries, spanning roughly the 10th to the 14th century, across countless kingdoms, duchies, and fragmented lordships, the overwhelming majority of the population lived as peasants. They were not the kings draped in luxurious silks and furs, dictating laws from gilded thrones. They were not the formidable knights clanking in shining armor, riding to battle or defending castles. They were the silent, largely unrecorded majority, men, women, and children, bound to the land by an intricate and rigid social system called feudalism. In this system, a powerful lord held ultimate ownership over vast tracts of land. In exchange for the right to work a small plot of land for their own sustenance, and the theoretical promise of the lord's protection against raiders or rival lords, the peasants owed him extensive labor, a portion of their harvest, and unwavering obedience. But this protection often came at a steep, often crushing price, one that kept them perpetually balanced on the razor's edge of subsistence. Their days were not shaped by the grand politics of courts or the distant clamor of wars between nobles, but by the biting, bone-deep cold of winter, the tentative promise of spring's first shoots, and the ever-present, looming threat of famine that could, in a single bad season, wipe out entire families or villages. And while our immersive journey will begin within the damp, often relentlessly cold fields and humble dwellings of Europe, it is crucial to remember that across vast continents and diverse landscapes, from the sun-baked plains of India to the meticulously cultivated rice paddies of Asia, and even the arid steppes of North Africa, countless other hands tilled the earth. These people, too, face similar grueling sunrises and uncertain sets, often teetering on the very edge of sheer survival. The specifics of their crops, their deities, or their overlords might have varied. But the fundamental struggle against nature and the ceaseless pursuit of enough food to live were universal human experiences. This common thread of elemental struggle binds us to them across the vast expanse of time and geography. Now let's truly step into their worn, rough shoes in the pre-dawn gloom that blankets a small, simple, often windowless hut. The air within is thick and heavy, a suffocating blend of the lingering scent of wood smoke from last night's dying fire, the damp, earthy smell of the packed dirt floor, and the unmistakable, close aroma of unwashed bodies. Outside, the world is still completely cloaked in deep darkness. broken only by the first, hesitant chirps of awakening birds and the familiar, almost ritualistic, distant crow of a rooster that serves as the village's stark alarm clock. Inside, the profound chill of the early morning seeps into every bone, a constant companion. There's no soft mattress to sink into, no warm, fluffy duvet to pull up against the cold. Just a rough, straw-filled pallet, perhaps slightly raised from the floor to avoid the worst of the damp, shared amongst the entire family, offering scant comfort against the cold, unyielding ground. The silence, before the day's true work begins, is broken only by the sounds of the dwelling itself. A deep, rattling cough echoes from a corner of the hut, perhaps from an elder or a child suffering from the persistent damp. A child's restless sigh, a small whimper quickly hushed by a mother's tired hand. Slowly, painfully stiffly, figures begin to stir from their shallow slumber. Every movement is deliberate, an economy of effort born not from laziness, but from perpetual exhaustion and the need to conserve every ounce of precious energy. There is no lingering, no indulgence in extra sleep. The day and its relentless demands for their very survival has already begun its merciless cycle. The moment their eyes open, the silent, unspoken command is clear: work or perish. The air within the peasant's hut remained heavy, a mixture of cold and stale warmth. As the family roused themselves, the first order of the day was the morning meal. This wasn't a time for culinary delight. It was a stark, functional necessity. For many across medieval Europe, breakfast was a simple, often monotonous affair. A wooden bowl might hold a spoonful of pottage, a thin stew made from whatever grains and vegetables were available, perhaps a handful of peas or beans. Alongside it, a chunk of coarse, dark bread, dense and heavy, would be torn or cut. Washed down with a sip of weak, homemade ale, this was their sustenance. This wasn't a meal for pleasure. It was fuel for survival, just enough to fend off the gnawing hunger before the day's back-breaking labor truly began. Every single calorie counted. Waste was not an option. Children learned quickly to scrape their bowls clean, understanding implicitly that food was precious. For them, the promise of the next meal was a constant, underlying thought. The slight warmth from the pottage, the density of the bread, these were tiny comforts against the ever-present cold and the looming emptiness of their stomach. They ate quickly, silently, each mouthful a conscious act of preparing their bodies for the arduous hours ahead, a direct link to their continued existence. There was no conversation, no lingering, only the quiet focus on consuming what little was available. This reality wasn't unique to Europe. Compare this with the staple of rice for a peasant family waking in medieval China or Japan. While the specific grain differed, the morning meal, though often simple, was equally vital. Whether it was bowls of steaming rice with a few pickled vegetables or a handful of millet porridge, the goal remained the same across continents: to provide just enough energy to face the long, arduous day ahead. It was a universal human experience of starting the day with a survival ration. Even in warmer climates, the effort to cultivate and prepare these staple foods was immense, demanding immediate replenishment of energy stores each morning. The tools might change, the specific taste might vary, but the fundamental struggle to acquire and consume enough calories for another day of toil was a shared bond across the medieval world. After the hasty meal, the process of getting dressed was swift and uncomplicated. Fashion was a foreign concept, a luxury for the privileged few. Their clothing consisted of simple, rough woolen tunics and trousers for the men, long dresses and aprons for the women. These garments were intensely practical and functional, designed for durability and warmth against the elements, not for comfort or display. They were hand-spun and hand-woven from raw materials, patched countless times until the original fabric was barely discernible beneath layers of repairs. Clothes were worn until they literally fell apart, then perhaps repurposed for rags. Personal hygiene, by modern standards, was minimal. Water was a precious commodity, often hauled with great effort from a communal well or stream, and used sparingly for drinking and cooking. A quick wash of hands and face might be all that was afforded, as the real, physically demanding work of the day demanded their immediate attention. There was no time and few resources for extensive cleanliness. As the first sliver of gray light filtered through the smoke hole or the cracks in the rough timber walls, signaling the true arrival of dawn, the family began their initial chores around the immediate vicinity of the hut. The central fire, which had dwindled to smoldering embers overnight to conserve precious fuel, needed to be coaxed back to life. This was a vital task, providing not just warmth against the persistent chill, also the means for cooking the next meager meal. Animals, often sharing the dwelling space during harsh winter months for warmth and security, needed tending. Perhaps a cow had to be milked, its precious output essential for the family's diet. Chickens needed to be fed, their eggs a rare protein boost. Pigs, if the family was fortunate enough to own any, were let out to forage. Every single member of the family, from the youngest child capable of carrying a small pail of water or collecting kindling, to the eldest, had a designated role to play. There was no idleness in a life where survival was the constant, non-negotiable objective. The sounds of the waking village would slowly grow into a collective hum of activity. Distant voices would carry on the crisp morning air, perhaps the rhythmic clatter of a bucket being lowered into a well, or another rooster crowing in a neighboring dwelling, joining the symphony of a community awakening to labor. One by one, or in small groups for mutual support and company, the men and often the women and older children would begin their long, deliberate walk to the communal fields. The sight of neighbors also heading out, their figures silhouetted against the strengthening dawn, offered a small comfort. It was a shared destiny, a communal march towards another day of relentless labor, where every hour spent working the soil was a direct investment in the family's fragile survival. The sun was beginning its slow ascent, painting the sky with pale colors, and with its climb, the unwavering demands of the day had officially begun. Their very existence hung on the success of the harvest, and that harvest began with these first tireless and utterly crucial steps out into the cold, expectant morning. As the sun crept higher, transforming the pre-dawn gloom into a pale work-ready light, casting long, stark shadows across the dew-kissed fields, the peasants' real, grueling day truly began. These vast, open spaces, stretching for miles across the rolling landscape, were not merely fields of green or brown. For them, these lands were an unyielding battleground for survival. Every single seed painstakingly sown by hand, every laborious furrow slowly plowed, every heavy clod of earth grudgingly turned, was not just agricultural labor. It was a desperate high-stakes gamble against the capricious forces of nature and the demanding, unforgiving will of their lord. Their very existence, the life and death of their entire family, hung precariously on the success of the harvest that these fields promised, all too often tragically withheld. The constant chilling fear of famine gnawed at their bellies and drove every aching muscle, every weary, shallow breath. They knew in their very bones that a failed harvest meant not just hardship or discomfort, but a slow, agonizing descent into starvation for their entire family, a brutal reality that was all too common and frequently experienced in these unpredictable times. The primary focus for many during this crucial period would have been the spring plowing, a task that determined the yield and thus the sustenance of the coming year. The tools they wielded were remarkably rudimentary, brutally heavy, and utterly unforgiving in their simplicity. The main implement was the ard or scratch plow, a basic wooden device often tipped with a precious hard-earned iron share. Unlike the more advanced plows that would come much later, this ancient design did not turn the soil over to aerate it. It merely scratched a shallow furrow. This meant that the same ground often required multiple, back and forth passes to adequately prepare it for sowing, intensifying the already immense physical exertion demanded. Often, a team of strong, slow, but remarkably powerful oxen would be yoked to the ard, pulling it steadily through the stubborn earth. Guiding these massive beasts, managing their pace, and ensuring a straight, effective furrow demanded incredible strength, unwavering endurance, and a lifetime of hard-won skill from the farm. Imagine the jarring impact on their hands and arms, the constant, grinding strain on their backs and shoulders, from the moment the sun rose until it dipped below the horizon, under a sky that could turn from benign and promising to brutal and unforgiving in a matter of hours. The sheer physical toll of this work was monumental. The ground itself, often compacted and stubborn after the long, wet winter, fought back against their efforts. Some fields might be heavy clay, clinging stubbornly to the plow. Others might be thin, stony soil, prone to erosion. Each step was heavy. Each push of the wooden plow handle a profound test of their raw resolve and physical limits. They worked not on individual, fenced-off plots, but in long, narrow, communal strips within the larger open field system. This meant they often toiled side by side with their neighbors, a silent testament to their shared burden and their collective struggle for survival. The communal nature of the fields also meant that they plowed not just their own small, precious strip, but also, crucially, the Lord's larger, often more fertile land. This was a bitter, unavoidable obligation that often had to be completed first, before any attention could be turned to their own family's needs. This leads us to one of the most significant and oppressive burdens on their lives, a systemic constraint that fundamentally undermined their ceaseless efforts for self-preservation, the feudal burden. The vast majority of peasants in medieval Europe were not free individuals. They were known as serfs, bound irrevocably to the land they worked, and by extension, to their powerful lord. This unbreakable bond manifested most harshly and directly in the form of forced labor, a system known as corvée. A significant portion of their already limited week, perhaps 2 or 3 entire days, and sometimes even more during the critical peak seasons of plowing and harvest, was spent working directly on the Lord's vast estate, his domain. This labor had to be completed meticulously and to the Lord's satisfaction before they were even permitted to touch their own small family plots. This wasn't a choice. It was a non-negotiable, rigidly enforced duty, overseen by the Lord's stern bailiffs and local reeves, who wielded considerable power and could impose harsh penalties for disobedience or perceived laziness. This unwavering obligation was not merely an inconvenience or a tiresome chore. It was a direct and profound threat to their survival. Every hour, every day, every moment spent working for the Lord meant less time on their own, often meager strips of land. Less time meant less thorough plowing, less meticulous weeding, and ultimately, a dramatically reduced yield from their own crop. For a family already living perpetually on the very verge of hunger, where every meal was a hard-won victory, every lost hour on their own plot, every bushel of grain they could not harvest for themselves, pushed them irrevocably closer to the absolute brink of starvation. They were, in essence, farming not primarily for their own sustenance, but also to fulfill a debt that often left them with barely enough, if anything, to truly survive. This was the brutal, unyielding reality of serfdom. Their very labor, their only true asset and means of existence, was largely controlled and exploited by another, leaving them in a perpetual state of inherent vulnerability and dependence. The sun beat down mercilessly, the wind bit with icy teeth, and their bodies ached incessantly, not just from the immense physical demands of agriculture, but from the systemic, crushing weight of a life where personal freedom was a distant, unattainable dream, and survival an ongoing, precarious, and often desperate negotiation against overwhelming odds. Each ache, each blister, was a grim reminder of their place in the world, and the constant fight they faced just to see another dawn. The sheer back-breaking labor of the European peasant was a universal truth for agricultural communities across the medieval world, yet the specific challenges and techniques could differ profoundly. While our European peasant battled with heavy wooden plows across vast open fields, trying to coax sustenance from often stubborn soil, peasants thousands of miles away faced their own unique forms of toil. Across Japan, for instance, families meticulously worked rice paddies, a delicate yet equally strenuous form of agriculture. Instead of wide plains, they often had to transform mountainous terrain into intricate terraced fields, an astonishing feat of engineering achieved through sheer ingenuity and relentless manual labor. Every precious grain of rice was fought for, every terrace carefully constructed and maintained to optimize water flow, all a testament to their desperate need to maximize yield from limited, difficult land. This was their direct confrontation with nature, their unique path to survival. Similarly, the European peasants' relationship with their lord and the land, though oppressive, contrasts with the structures found elsewhere. The land they worked, though often bound by serfdom to a local lord in Europe, might be under a more centralized imperial tax system in China. Here, the mighty emperor's granaries demanded their formidable share of the harvest, often just as fiercely as a European lord's domain. While the European serf owed labor directly to their lord, the Chinese peasant often paid taxes primarily in grain, with additional labor obligations for public works, like canals or roads. In both cases, the peasant was the ultimate source of wealth, their surplus essential for sustaining the ruling elite, often leaving them with barely enough, if they were lucky, for their own survival. The specific mechanisms of control varied, but the fundamental reality of the peasant as the foundation of society, often exploited and vulnerable, remained tragically consistent. Beyond the burdens imposed by human systems, the peasant's life was perpetually overshadowed by the unpredictable, often brutal hand of nature. Their existence was an unending gamble against forces they could neither control nor fully understand. The threats were relentless and pervasive, capable of wiping out an entire family's food supply in a single devastating blow. Unpredictable weather patterns were the most common and terrifying enemy. A prolonged drought could bake the soil hard as rock, shriveling young crops before they could even mature, turning fertile fields into dusty, barren expanses. Conversely, excessive, relentless floods could wash away entire harvests, drowning crops and saturating fields, rendering them unworkable for weeks or months. A sudden, violent hailstorm could shred tender leaves and flatten ripening grains in minutes, destroying the accumulated labor of an entire season. Any of these natural disasters meant not just hardship, but a direct path to starvation for the family and the entire community. Beyond the weather, devastating crop diseases were a constant, silent terror. Rust, mildew, and blights could sweep through fields with terrifying speed, turning vibrant green plants into withered, black husks. Once a disease took hold, there was no cure, no pesticide, only the agonizing watch as their livelihood rotted before their eyes. Likewise, insect infestations could spell doom. Swarms of locusts, armies of caterpillars, or relentless beetles could descend upon the fields, consuming everything in their path, leaving nothing but bare stalks, where promise once stood. And then there were the wild animals, wolves preying on livestock, deer trampling young shoots, or flocks of birds devouring precious seeds. Every single one of these occurrences, seemingly minor in isolation, could, in a single season, utterly devastate a family's entire food supply, condemning them to hunger, illness, and often an agonizing death. Survival was a daily miracle, a constant negotiation with an indifferent, often hostile natural world. The physical demands of their labor also carried inherent dangers. Working with simple, heavy tools in all weather conditions meant that accidents were tragically common. A slip of the axe while clearing land, a misstep with a scythe, or being kicked by an oxen could result in a broken bone, a deep laceration, or a debilitating injury. For a peasant, a severe injury could mean the abrupt end of their ability to work, and thus the end of their ability to provide for their family. In a world with no social safety net, no disability benefits, and extremely rudimentary medical care, an injury could quickly lead to destitution and death. The constant threat of illness, accident, and the unpredictable wrath of nature meant that the peasant lived a life where survival was never a given, but a precious, hard-won triumph against overwhelming odds. Every sunrise brought the same cycle of relentless effort, every sunset a profound uncertainty, and every moment in between a testament to their sheer, indomitable will to endure. Amidst the relentless individual toil and the constant threats to their very survival, the peasant's life was rarely lived in isolation. The medieval village was a tightly knit web of interdependence, a necessity born from the sheer difficulty of their existence. When one family faced a crisis, it often affected the entire community, and conversely, collective action was often the only way to overcome insurmountable obstacles. This vital reliance on one another, this unspoken pact of mutual aid, was perhaps the most crucial shared strategy for survival in their harsh world. During peak seasons like the frantic weeks of harvest or the critical days of plowing, the communal fields became a scene of intense cooperative effort. Families would often help each other, moving from one strip of land to another, lending an extra pair of hands or an extra ox. This wasn't charity. It was a pragmatic understanding that their individual yields were interconnected, and that the failure of one might weaken the entire village's ability to endure. The collective strength became their shield against the ever-present threat of scarcity. Imagine the scene: a dozen or more villagers, men and women, working side by side under the relentless sun or through the biting wind. The rhythmic swing of scythes through ripening grain, the dull thud of flails separating wheat from chaff, the shouts of encouragement or warnings as heavy loads were lifted. A child might bring water to parched throats, their small contribution vital. This shared labor fostered a profound sense of camaraderie, a bond forged in sweat and hardship. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, their joys and their sorrows, intimately. They were more than neighbors. They were fellow soldiers in the daily war against hunger and the elements. Laughter, however rare, would break through the grunts of effort, a fleeting moment of human connection against the vast indifference of the landscape. Despite the back-breaking demands, there were fleeting, precious moments of respite. These were not extended breaks or leisurely pauses, but brief, snatched intervals of rest born from necessity. Perhaps a quick gulp of water from a leather flask, passed around amongst those toiling. A moment to straighten an aching back, to wipe sweat from a brow, to lean against a rough wooden tool and catch a breath. They might sit for a few minutes under the sparse shade of a tree at the edge of the field, their eyes scanning the sky for any sign of changing weather, their minds already calculating the remaining work. These short pauses were not about relaxation in the modern sense. They were about conservation, about managing their precious energy reserves, about ensuring they had just enough strength to complete the day's tasks. Even these small moments were carefully considered, a vital component of their survival strategy, ensuring they did not push their bodies beyond the point of collapse. Observation of the world around them during these moments might offer small insights. The behavior of birds, the subtle changes in the wind, all contributing to their innate, deeply ingrained knowledge of the land and its moods. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky with hues of orange and purple, signaling the end of another long, arduous day, the communal rhythm of the fields would slowly wind down. One by one, then in small groups, the exhausted peasants would begin their journey home. Their bodies were stiff and aching, every muscle protesting the day's relentless demands. Their movements were heavy, their gait slow, a stark contrast to the urgency with which they had set out that morning. The tools were slung over shoulders or dragged behind them, their weight now feeling unbearable. This walk back to the village was more than just a physical journey. It was a mental unwinding, a quiet processing of the day's toil, and the continuing struggle that awaited them tomorrow. The silence of their return was profound, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the dirt path, the lowing of cattle, or the distant barking of a dog. There was little energy left for conversation. Each individual was lost in their own thoughts, perhaps reflecting on the progress made, the yield hoped for, or the constant anxieties that permeated their existence. They would pass their neighbors on the path, offering perhaps a tired nod or a brief, understanding glance. This shared understanding, this unspoken acknowledgement of the brutal day they had all endured, further solidified the bonds of their community. As they approached the cluster of thatched roofs that formed their village, a faint sense of weary relief would settle over them. The sight of smoke curling from their own chimney, or the faint glow of a communal hearth, would be a welcome beacon. It signified not rest, not luxury, but merely the end of one form of labor and the transition to another within the familiar, if humble, confines of their home. The day in the fields was over, but the fight for survival was far from concluded. Each weary step towards their dwelling was a testament to their enduring spirit, a silent declaration of their sheer will to live, to provide, to see another dawn. This journey home was the closing chapter of one daily battle and the preparation for the next. As the weary peasant returned from the unforgiving fields, a new sphere of tireless labor, equally vital for survival, began within the humble confines of their home. This was largely the woman's domain, a relentless cycle of domestic chores that was every bit as demanding as the men's work in the fields, and perhaps even more constant. Her day began before dawn and often ended long after sunset, punctuated by tasks that directly ensured the family's immediate well-being and long-term endurance. Every single activity she performed, from the most seemingly mundane to the physically taxing, was an intricate part of the exhaustive system required to keep the family not just fed, but genuinely alive in a world of pervasive scarcity. Imagine the daily scene. The hearth, a simple fire pit on the packed earth floor, often without a chimney, filling the small space with smoke. Yet it was the pulsating heart of the home. Here the woman managed the cooking. Every meal was a meticulous act of turning raw, often meager ingredients into something edible and nourishing. It involved carefully stirring the bubbling pottage, ensuring nothing burned, adding whatever sparse vegetables or herbs might have been gathered from the garden or the wild. She was responsible for the continuous baking of bread, the fundamental staple of their diet. This meant grinding grain, a strenuous task often done by hand using a quern or stone mill, sometimes for hours. The heavy stones had to be turned repeatedly, a repetitive motion that tired the arms and shoulders, all to produce the flour essential for the next loaf. After grinding, the dough was kneaded, shaped, and then baked, either in a shared communal oven, which meant a trip to the village bakehouse, or directly in the embers of her own hearth. Each loaf was a triumph against hunger, a symbol of their continuous fight for survival. Beyond cooking, the woman's responsibilities stretched to every corner of their meager existence. She was the primary caregiver for the children, raising them not just with love, but with an early introduction to the harsh realities of their life and their future roles in the family's labor. She managed the small kitchen garden, if they had one, cultivating herbs, onions, cabbage, and other greens that supplemented their diet and provided crucial vitamins. This small plot, tended with immense care, could mean the difference between mere subsistence and utter starvation. Her domain also included the crucial time-consuming tasks of textile production. She was the one who processed the raw wool from their sheep, meticulously cleaning and preparing it. Then came the endless hours of spinning, transforming fluffy clumps of wool into thread using a drop spindle or a simple spinning wheel. This thread would then be used for weaving cloth on a basic loom or for knitting and mending. Clothing was not easily acquired. It was a product of immense labor. Every stitch she made, every tear she mended, every worn garment she patched, prolonged the life of their precious clothing, saving the family from having to acquire new materials, which was a luxury they could ill afford. This constant act of creation and repair was a direct contribution to the family's economic survival, ensuring they had protection against the cold and the elements. Water collection was another daily, physically demanding chore, often involving multiple trips to the communal well or a nearby stream, carrying heavy pails back to the hut. Firewood had to be gathered, a task that might involve foraging in nearby woods, always under the watchful eye of the Lord's forester, as wood was a controlled resource. She might also be responsible for caring for any small animals kept near the dwelling, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, tending to a pig or a few goats. All these actions, seemingly separate, were interwoven into a seamless, ceaseless system of resource management aimed at securing the family's basic needs. There was no clear division between work and leisure for the peasant woman. Her life was a continuous cycle of necessary tasks. Her ingenuity in stretching meager rations, her resilience in facing constant discomfort, and her unwavering dedication to nurturing the young were the very fabric of their existence. Without her ceaseless contribution, the family's tenuous hold on survival would have been far more precarious, perhaps even impossible. She was the silent, indispensable architect of the home, transforming scarce resources into life itself. Within the peasant's dwelling, the preparation of food transcended simple cooking. It was an intricate, painstaking art of resource management, dictated by scarcity. Every single step, from raw ingredient to finished meal, was a testament to their desperate ingenuity in extracting maximum sustenance from minimum resources. This daily ritual was not about culinary indulgence, but about the very act of survival. The arduous process began with the most fundamental staple, grain. If the family was fortunate enough to have their own grain, it still needed to be processed. Grinding grain into flour was a physically demanding and incredibly time-consuming chore. Often this was done by hand using a quern, two heavy stones, one stationary, one turned manually. Hours were spent hunched over, rotating the top stone against the bottom, listening to the rhythmic rasp of grain being crushed into coarse flour. The effort involved was immense, tiring the arms, back, and shoulders, but it was indispensable. Without flour, there was no bread, and without bread, there was no life. Once the precious flour was obtained, the work continued. Dough had to be kneaded, a laborious task that built strong hands and aching forearms. The dough was then shaped, often into simple, round loaves, before being baked. For many, this meant a trip to the communal oven in the village bakehouse, a shared resource that required precise timing and coordination with other families. For those in more isolated dwellings, or perhaps too poor for the communal oven fee, bread might be baked directly in the embers of their own hearth, a dangerous and inconsistent method. Every crumb of that heavy dark bread was precious, every scrap saved, reinforcing the constant, underlying truth that food was not to be wasted. This constant cycle of acquisition, processing, and careful consumption was a direct daily confrontation with hunger, a vital part of their ongoing fight for survival. Childhood in the medieval peasant world was tragically short and profoundly different from any modern concept. It was often marked by the devastating reality of high infant and child mortality rates. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents claimed countless young lives before they ever reached adulthood. Surviving infancy was a lottery, a testament to sheer luck and a mother's tireless care amidst overwhelming odds. Those who did manage to endure the precarious early years quickly learned the harsh necessities of their existence. There was no extended period of playful idleness. Children were expected to contribute to the household economy from a remarkably young age. A small child might be tasked with simple chores like collecting firewood, tending to younger siblings, or scaring birds from the crops. As they grew, their responsibilities increased, progressing to caring for animals, helping in the garden, or assisting with spinning and weaving. Every single pair of hands, no matter how small, was essential for the family's collective survival. Play, when it happened, was often simple, spontaneous, and short-lived, quickly yielding to the ever-present demands of work. Their childhood was a direct apprenticeship in the art of subsistence, preparing them for a life of ceaseless labor. This intricate, tireless work within the home, driven by the absolute necessity of survival, resonated far beyond the borders of Europe. The fundamental role of women in managing complex domestic economies was a universal truth. Consider, for example, the Chinese households of the same period. While they might operate within a different social and political framework, Chinese women similarly manage the intricacies of food preparation, textile production, and childcare. Critically, these Chinese households often existed within larger, extended family units, providing a wider and often more resilient support network against the ever-present threats to survival than the generally smaller, more nuclear families often found in medieval Europe. This extended family structure could mean more hands for labor, more resources to pool during hardship, and a more robust safety net in times of illness or famine. Similarly, in Japan, peasant women faced their own unique domestic challenges and responsibilities. While spinning wool was a common European task, Japanese women might be meticulously crafting textiles from locally available materials like silk or hemp, a process requiring immense skill and dedication. These handmade fabrics were crucial for clothing and other household necessities, directly contributing to the family's ability to endure harsh winters or humid summers. Each thread spun, each piece of cloth woven, was a testament to their tireless dedication to providing for their families in a harsh and often unforgiving world. Regardless of the specific materials or cultural practices, the underlying dedication to making, mending, and managing resources for the family's fundamental survival remained a shared, universal experience across continents. The hearth, whether in a European hut, a Chinese farmhouse, or a Japanese dwelling, was the vital epicenter of this tireless, life-sustaining work. Beyond the constant struggle against hunger and the demands of the land, the medieval peasant faced another insidious and equally terrifying enemy: disease. In their world, basic sanitation was rudimentary at best, and often non-existent by modern standards, creating a perpetual breeding ground for illness. Dwellings were small, often shared with livestock, and lacked proper ventilation or plumbing. Waste disposal was primitive, typically involving simply throwing refuse onto the street or into a nearby ditch, where it accumulated and attracted vermin. Clean drinking water was a constant challenge. Water was often drawn from communal wells or rivers that might also serve as waste disposal sites, leading to widespread contamination. This combination of poor hygiene, close living quarters, and contaminated water ensured that illness was not an exception, but a constant, pervasive reality for every individual and every family. The prevalence of disease was staggering. Common ailments that are easily treatable today could swiftly become death sentences. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and food, would sweep through villages, dehydrating and weakening victims. Fevers, their origins mysterious to the medieval mind, would burn through bodies, leaving behind weakness or death. Respiratory issues, exacerbated by smoky, unventilated huts, were chronic. Smallpox, measles, diphtheria, and influenza were recurring scourges that decimated populations with terrifying regularity. Once a contagious illness took hold in a crowded village, it spread like wildfire, infecting rich and poor alike, but disproportionately impacting the already weakened and malnourished peasant population. The understanding of medicine was, by our standards, incredibly limited. The concept of germs was entirely unknown, leading to ineffective and often dangerous treatments. Village healers, if available, relied on a mixture of herbal remedies, superstitious practices, and basic first aid. Bleeding, purging, and various charms were common practices, often doing more harm than good. Serious injuries or complex illnesses were almost always fatal. There were no antibiotics to fight infections, no vaccines to prevent widespread outbreaks, and very little understanding of how diseases transmitted from person to person. A simple cut could become infected, leading to gangrene and death. A common cold could quickly escalate into fatal pneumonia. The body, already weakened by hard labor and a poor diet, had little defense against these relentless assaults. This lack of medical knowledge and care meant that disease was a constant, terrifying enemy, capable of wiping out entire families or devastating villages. For a peasant, falling ill was not merely a discomfort. It was a profound threat to their survival. An individual's illness meant they could not work, and for a family living hand to mouth, every lost day of labor meant a direct reduction in their meager food supply. If the primary breadwinner fell sick, the entire family could face destitution and starvation. Children were especially vulnerable. Infant and child mortality rates were horrifyingly high, a stark reminder of life's fragility. Parents knew that many of their children might not live to adulthood, a sorrowful reality woven into the fabric of daily life. Beyond individual suffering, a single epidemic could decimate a community. The Black Death in the 14th century is the most infamous example, wiping out up to half of Europe's population. But even smaller, more localized outbreaks could leave survivors reeling, with fewer hands to work the fields, fewer mouths to feed perhaps, but also a profound loss of knowledge, community strength, and emotional well-being. There were no public health measures, no quarantines in the modern sense, no understanding of how to control the spread of infection effectively. They were at the mercy of invisible forces, left to pray and hope they would be spared the next wave of sickness. The threat of illness and sudden death was a silent, ever-present companion, making every day of healthy labor a hard-won victory and a testament to their enduring, fragile survival. Life was a constant negotiation, not only with the land and the Lord, but with the unseen, deadly pathogens that lurked in their environment. In the harsh, demanding world of the medieval peasant, where uncertainty was a daily companion and survival a constant battle, the church stood as an unwavering, colossal presence. It was far more than just a building made of stone or wood. The parish church was the undisputed center of their universe, both physically and spiritually. Its towering spire or sturdy bell tower dominated the village skyline, a constant visual reminder of God's omnipresence. It served as the social hub, the meeting place, the repository of news and gossip, and often the only place where literacy, however rudimentary, was preserved. It was also the village's clock, its bells dictating the rhythm of the day, with calls to matins, lauds, vespers, and compline, ordering their labor and their rest. Beyond this, it was the record keeper of life itself, noting births, marriages, and deaths in a world where personal documents were otherwise non-existent. Their faith was not merely a Sunday ritual, a polite obligation to be observed once a week. It was a deeply ingrained, visceral, and constant companion, woven inextricably into the very fabric of their daily existence. It was a vital source of comfort, meaning, and perhaps most importantly, hope in a world brimming with danger, suffering, and profound unpredictability. Daily devotion was an integral part of their lives. The Angelus bell, tolling thrice a day, would prompt them to pause in the fields or by the hearth to offer prayer. Saints' days dotted the calendar, offering not just opportunities for rare celebration, but also specific patrons to whom they could appeal for help with their very earthly, very immediate problems. They observed feast days with fervor and fasting days with somber discipline, believing devoutly that adherence to these spiritual rhythms would bring them favor in the eyes of God. These prayers were not abstract theological meditations. They were desperate, heartfelt pleas for tangible, practical outcomes directly linked to their survival. They prayed for good weather, for the timely arrival of rain, for the sun's gentle warmth, and for protection against hailstorms and floods. They prayed fervently for healthy crops, for the successful ripening of grain, for robust livestock. They implored saints for protection from illness, for a child's recovery from fever, for strength against the plague. The divine was not a distant, removed entity. God and the saints were seen as directly influencing every aspect of their agricultural year and their personal well-being, holding the keys to their prosperity or their ruin. Their very ability to live another day, to feed their children rested, they believed, in the hands of the divine. The peasant's spiritual world was a landscape of profound fear and fervent hope. The fear of damnation, of eternal suffering in hell, was a very real and terrifying prospect, preached from the pulpit and depicted in vivid, often gruesome, church paintings and carvings. But equally powerful was the fervent hope of salvation, of divine mercy, and of miraculous intervention for their earthly needs. The omnipresent threat of the devil and evil spirits was not just a theological concept. It was often directly connected to real-world misfortunes. A sudden blight on the crops, a mysterious illness that struck down a healthy animal, a persistent string of bad luck, these could all be attributed to malevolent spiritual forces. This worldview cemented the idea that good fortune, health, and crucially, their survival were battles fought on both earthly and spiritual planes. The unseen world was constantly interacting with their physical reality. The village priest played a multifaceted, indispensable role in their lives. He was, first and foremost, their spiritual guide, administering the sacraments, hearing confessions, and offering spiritual solace. But his influence extended far beyond the purely religious. He was often the most educated person in the village, acting as a rudimentary educator, teaching basic catechism, and sometimes even reading and writing. He kept the parish records, making him the keeper of the community's history. He served as a moral authority, mediating disputes between villagers and offering advice. In many ways, he was a linchpin of local governance, bridging the gap between the peasants and the distant authority of the lord or the bishop. His presence was a constant reminder of the church's encompassing reach, offering both structure and a glimmer of hope in a relentlessly difficult life. Ultimately, their world was not merely one of relentless toil and physical hardship, but of profound spiritual landscapes. It was a place where the divine and the demonic walked hand in hand with their daily lives, offering solace, instilling fear, and providing a framework of meaning in the unending, precarious quest for survival. Their unwavering faith was not a luxury. It was a fundamental tool for enduring the unimaginable, providing the mental and emotional fortitude to face another dawn, another day of brutal labor, and another season of hope against the odds. While the official teachings of the Christian Church provided the overarching framework for their spiritual lives, the medieval peasants' daily reality was also deeply infused with an older, more primal layer of folk beliefs and superstition. This was not necessarily a rejection of Christian dogma, but rather a practical, often desperate, blending of the new faith with ancient pagan traditions and deeply ingrained local customs. In a world where so much was inexplicable and uncontrollable, these beliefs offered an additional, tangible layer of protection, a way to exert some small measure of influence over their unpredictable environment, and crucially, to enhance their chances of survival. They believed devoutly in a hidden world, teeming with invisible forces, mischievous fae that could sour milk or lead travelers astray, malevolent goblins lurking in dark woods, or benevolent spirits tied to specific springs or ancient trees. Charms were common talismans. A dried toad hung in the rafters to ward off disease, a specific knot tied to prevent a cow from going dry, or a particular herb carried to ensure a safe journey. Omens were read everywhere: the flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the behavior of animals. A sudden illness might not just be God's will. It could be the result of an evil eye or a curse. A good harvest might be blessed by God, but perhaps also by leaving a small offering at a crossroads for older, unnamed powers. Every unusual event, every unexplained misfortune or stroke of luck was seen through this lens, prompting specific rituals or actions intended to appease, protect, or invite fortune. These practices were not viewed as separate from their Christian faith, but often as complementary methods for navigating the perilous intricacies of their world and increasing their odds of survival. They were practical steps taken to safeguard their crops, their livestock, their health, and their very lives from perceived magical threats. Their spiritual lives were, therefore, deeply and intricately entwined with their tangible world, a universal human need to make sense of suffering and to find comfort and solace in the unrelenting struggle for survival. Just as the all-encompassing Catholic Church defined the spiritual and often social landscape in Europe, so too did different belief systems shape the lives of peasants in other parts of the world, influencing their festivals, their rituals, and their fundamental understanding of the natural and supernatural. Consider the peasants in Japan, for example. Their spiritual landscape was primarily shaped by a dynamic interplay between Buddhism and Shintoism. Shintoism, an indigenous Japanese religion, revered kami, spirits or deities associated with nature, ancestors, and specific places. Farmers would engage in rituals and prayers at local shrines dedicated to nature kami, making fervent appeals for bountiful harvests, for gentle rains, and for protection from natural disasters like typhoons or earthquakes, all of which directly impacted their survival. Buddhist practices, on the other hand, often focused on spiritual enlightenment and karmic consequences. Yet these too were integrated into daily life, influencing moral conduct and providing solace in the face of death and hardship. The line between these faiths was often fluid, with peasants embracing elements of both, much like the European peasant blended Christian and pagan beliefs, all in the service of navigating a challenging existence. In China, the spiritual lives of peasants were even more complex, often a rich pragmatic blend of Buddhism, Taoism, and the deeply ingrained practice of Confucian ancestral worship. Taoism offered philosophical guidance on harmony with nature and the cosmos, while folk Taoism involved rituals to ward off evil spirits and attract good fortune. Buddhism, introduced centuries earlier, provided a framework for morality, karma, and the afterlife. Crucially, ancestral worship, rooted in Confucian principles, was paramount. Peasants would meticulously maintain ancestral shrines and perform elaborate rituals to honor their forebears, believing that benevolent ancestors could intervene on their behalf, bringing prosperity, warding off malevolent forces, and ensuring the health and continuation of the family line. These practices were not just about abstract morality. They were fundamentally about securing good fortune, avoiding disaster, and ensuring the ongoing survival and prosperity of the family unit across generations. The state often exerted control over religious institutions, a structure distinct from the papacy's power in the West, yet the fundamental needs addressed by these faiths remained strikingly similar globally. Across all these cultures, despite the vast differences in deities, doctrines, or rituals, the underlying human desires remained strikingly consistent. The desperate plea for good fortune, fervent prayers for protection from evil or misfortune, and a profound, fundamental need to understand their place in the cosmos in the face of constant existential threat. Whether kneeling before a Christian crucifix, a Shinto shrine, or an ancestral tablet, the peasant sought guidance, comfort, and most importantly, a tangible divine intervention to help them in their unending struggle for survival. Their spiritual world was not a detached realm of abstract thought. It was a living, breathing part of their daily battle for existence, offering hope, explaining suffering, and providing a powerful framework for enduring the unimaginable. The peasant's life was not a linear progression, but an unending, precarious dance dictated entirely by the agricultural calendar. Every single season brought its own specific, arduous labors, and with them, its own unique set of existential risks. Spring planting, though exhausting, was a time of hopeful anticipation, a period where the seeds of their future were quite literally placed into the earth. Summer brought the relentless toil of weeding and tending, guarding the nascent crops from pests and disease. Autumn harvest was the pivotal moment, the culmination of all their effort. It delivered either the salvation of a bountiful yield or the profound despair of a failed crop. Winter, while offering a slight respite from field work, brought its own challenges of cold and scarcity, forcing them to live off their precious, carefully hoarded stores. Their very existence was bound to this cyclical rhythm, a testament to nature's power over their lives. Amidst this relentless grind, these arduous cycles of sowing and reaping, there were precious, intermittent moments of light, the feasts and celebrations. These were not merely social gatherings. They were absolutely vital releases from the constant crusher of survival. These feast days, often tied to significant Christian holidays like Christmas or Easter, or ancient pagan festivals absorbed into the Christian calendar like May Day or harvest festivals, were transformative. They were rare occasions for community bonding, for spirited revelry, and for fleeting indulgences in simple pleasure. Imagine the anticipation building for weeks, then the brief, glorious explosion of joy. Communal feasting, where the meager daily rations were replaced by slightly more substantial food, perhaps a taste of meat or cheese rarely consumed. There would be dancing to the simple, rhythmic tunes of pipes or drums. Games, however simple, would be played with boisterous energy. These moments were not just about pleasure, they were about psychic and emotional replenishment. They recharged weary spirits, allowing the peasants to momentarily forget the daily grind, providing the mental fortitude needed to face the next season's inevitable struggle. These celebrations were often directly tied to successful harvests, serving as powerful communal acts of thanksgiving for the very continuation of their lives. A good harvest meant not just food, but the precious opportunity for these vital communal rejoicings. But the joy of a feast was always tempered by a pervasive looming shadow, the chilling specter of famine. This wasn't a rare, historical anomaly. It was a cyclical dread, an ever-present threat that could descend upon them with brutal swiftness. A bad harvest due to too much relentless rain, too little vital sun, a prolonged devastating drought, or an unforeseen pest infestation could plunge an entire village, or even a whole region, into agonizing starvation. When the crops failed, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The grain stores would dwindle, then vanish. People would turn to desperate measures, eating whatever they could possibly find. Roots foraged from the meager forest, boiled tree bark, wild weeds, even clay mixed with what little flour remained, anything to fill their aching, empty bellies. These substitutes, often indigestible or toxic, provided no real nourishment and often led to agonizing deaths, their bodies wasting away, ravaged by disease and hunger. The threat of starvation defined their choices, their fears, and their daily reality. It shaped their cautious habits, their careful hoarding of resources, and their deep-seated anxiety about the future. For the medieval peasant, survival was never guaranteed. It was a day-by-day, year-by-year battle fought with their bodies, their wits, and their enduring hope. This terrifying vulnerability to the whims of nature and the resulting specter of famine was a universal experience, not confined to Europe. Celebrations, too, were crucial moments of respite globally, often tied directly to thanks for a successful harvest and fervent hopes for continued survival. European harvest festivals found their powerful echoes in Japanese matsuri, vibrant community celebrations tied to agricultural cycles and local deities, where prayers for a good crop next year were not merely ritual, but vital pleas for life. These festivals in Japan, with their colorful parades and communal feasts, served a similar function to strengthen community bonds and to offer collective thanks and supplication for the sustenance of life. Yet just as feasts brought joy, famine was a shadow that loomed large over peasants everywhere, often with even more devastating and widespread effect than in Europe. A bad monsoon season in India, for example, could completely decimate rice or wheat crops across vast regions, leading to unimaginable widespread starvation and mass death that dwarfed localized European famine. These catastrophic events, spanning entire continents, vividly highlighted the universal, brutal vulnerability of those who lived closest to the land and whose very lives hinged entirely on its precarious bounty. The names of the crops changed, the gods they prayed to might differ. But the relentless cycle of labor, the brief joys of harvest celebration, and the ever-present fear of a failed crop leading to death by starvation formed a grim, unifying thread across the global peasant experience. Within this intense cycle of work, celebration, and constant threat, the fundamental life events of birth, death, and marriage continued to unfold. These milestones, though often overshadowed by the larger struggle for existence, were marked and celebrated or mourned within the close-knit community. A birth was a fragile hope for more hands to work the land, a marriage a pragmatic alliance for shared labor, and a death a profound loss. But also in grim times, sometimes a slight easing of the burden on finite resources. Each event, however personal, was also a communal affair, shaping the future of the village as a whole. The vulnerability to the capricious hand of nature, particularly the devastating threat of famine, was not a European anomaly, but a shared global reality that bound agricultural societies together in a grim fraternity of risk. Just as European peasants celebrated successful harvests with profound relief, knowing their survival for another year was secured, so too did communities across the world mark their moments of temporary abundance. European harvest festivals, with their joyous feasting and communal dancing, found their powerful echoes in Japanese matsuri, vibrant community celebrations deeply tied to agricultural cycles and the reverence of local deities. These Japanese festivals, often involving colorful processions, traditional music and ritual offerings, were explicit acts of thanksgiving for the gods' bounty and fervent prayers for the prosperity and protection of the next year's crop, essentially a collective plea for continued survival. They were moments where the entire village came together to reinforce social bonds and acknowledge their dependence on the land and the spiritual world. However, the inverse of these celebrations, the shadow of famine, also stretched across continents with terrifying uniformity, often with even more catastrophic effects than those experienced in Europe. While localized famines could devastate a European region, a bad monsoon season in India, for instance, could lead to widespread crop failures across vast stretches of land, decimating staple grains like rice or wheat. The consequences were unimaginable: mass starvation, widespread disease, and often death for millions. Such events starkly mirrored, and often tragically exceeded, the devastating impact of a failed European harvest, highlighting the universal, brutal vulnerability of those whose very lives were intricately and entirely woven into the precarious bounty of the land. Regardless of the continent, the crop, or the culture, the peasant's existence was fundamentally a negotiation with the unpredictable forces that could, at any moment, strip away their ability to feed themselves and their families. Their lives were a continuous testament to humanity's fragility when confronted by the overwhelming power of nature. Within this intense cycle of work, celebration, and constant threat, the fundamental life events of birth, death, and marriage continued to unfold, providing structure and meaning to individual lives, even as they were shaped by the larger struggle for existence. A birth was a complex mixture of joy and trepidation. Each new child was a precious gift, but also a new mouth to feed in a household always on the brink of scarcity. Yet, a child also represented hope for the future, a potential new pair of hands to contribute to the family's labor, bolstering their collective ability to survive once they reached maturity. The high infant mortality rates meant that many births were followed by swift sorrow, a harsh reality that parents had to brace themselves for. Despite the pain, life went on, driven by the imperative of procreation and continuation. Marriages were not primarily romantic endeavors in the modern sense. They were pragmatic alliances for shared labor and resources. They were agreements between families, designed to strengthen their collective capacity to work the land, produce children, and ensure economic stability. The bringing together of two working individuals, or two families pooling their meager resources, could significantly enhance their chances of survival. While some affection might grow, the practical benefits of the union were paramount. Wedding celebrations, though humble, were significant communal affairs, marking a new household and a reinforcement of the village's social fabric. Deaths, on the other hand, were a constant, pervasive presence, but no less impactful. While a funeral might offer a moment of shared grief and spiritual comfort, a death, particularly of a productive adult, could be economically catastrophic for a family. It meant fewer hands for work, a direct threat to their already fragile food supply. Yet in grim times of extreme hardship or famine, a death, however tragic, could sometimes paradoxically ease the unbearable burden on finite resources for the survivors. A brutal calculation born of sheer desperation. Burials would take place in the village churchyard, tying the departed to the spiritual and physical heart of their community. Beyond the challenges of nature, the peasants' precarious survival was also constantly threatened by the human structures of power, particularly the Lord's justice system. While the Lord theoretically offered protection, his court was also a mechanism for control and extraction, another layer of pressure on the peasants' meager existence. Even minor infractions, such as poaching a rabbit from the Lord's woods, letting livestock stray onto the domain, or failing to complete corvée work to the Lord's satisfaction, could result in harsh penalties. A fine, though it might seem small to us, could be devastating for a peasant family. It might mean parting with precious coins, or even worse, with a portion of their already meager grain reserves, or perhaps an animal. This direct confiscation of goods, their painstakingly acquired assets, could immediately push a family over the edge, turning hardship into outright starvation. The Lord's justice was swift and often severe, designed not for abstract fairness, but for maintaining order and extracting maximum value from his tenants. It was a constant reminder that their lives, their labor, and even their very ability to exist were ultimately subject to the will of another. This ever-present threat of punishment and forfeiture meant that peasants lived in a state of continuous vigilance, always aware that one misstep, one bad judgment, or one unforeseen circumstance could lead to the loss of the very resources they needed for survival. Their resilience was not just against the elements, but against a societal structure that constantly demanded more than they could comfortably give. As the sun, their only true clock, began its slow, inevitable descent towards the western horizon, painting the sky with the fiery hues of orange and purple, the grueling work in the fields finally came to a close. With the last glimmers of daylight fading, the weary peasants, their bodies stiff and aching from hours of unrelenting toil, would begin their quiet, solemn journey home. Every muscle protested, every joint screamed in protest against the day's relentless demands. Their movements were heavy, their gait slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the urgency with which they had embarked upon their tasks that morning. Tools, once wielded with determined vigor, now felt like unbearable weights slung over their slumped shoulders or dragged laboriously behind them through the dusty paths. This walk back to the village was more than just a physical passage. It was a mental unwinding, a profound processing of the day's brutal labor and the ever-present, continuing struggle that awaited them with the next dawn. The silence of their return was profound, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of their rough boots on the dirt path, the lowing of cattle returning to their enclosures, or the distant familiar barking of a dog. There was little energy left for conversation. Each individual was lost in their own thoughts, perhaps replaying the day's successes, however small, or brooding over anxieties about the next planting, the unpredictable weather, or the ever-present threat of the Lord's demands. They would pass their neighbors on the path, offering perhaps a tired nod, a brief, understanding glance, or a shared sigh of exhaustion. This unspoken acknowledgement of the brutal day they had all endured further solidified the bonds of their community, a shared burden that fostered a deep, quiet camaraderie. As they approached the cluster of thatched roofs that formed their village, now softened by the twilight, a faint, weary sense of relief would settle over them. The sight of smoke curling from their own chimney, or the faint, welcoming glow of a communal hearth through a windowless opening, would be a beacon. It signified not rest in the luxurious sense, but merely the end of one form of labor and the transition to another within the familiar, if humble, confines of their dwelling. The evening meal was typically simple, often a repetition of breakfast. A bowl of thin pottage, perhaps with some added vegetables if the garden was yielding, and another portion of their coarse bread. This food was carefully, even religiously, portioned to make it last, a strategic rationing of their precious resources before the long, hungry night. Gathering around the central hearth, the glowing embers casting flickering shadows on their tired faces, wasn't just for warmth, though that was a profound comfort. It was a primal gathering for safety, for sharing what little they had, a testament to their continued existence. This shared moment, however brief and simple, was a quiet victory against the day's hardships, a confirmation that they had, once again, scraped enough together to survive until morning. Though their bodies ached and their minds wrestled with the anxieties of survival, there were still moments for the transmission of culture and shared humanity. Oral traditions thrived in the absence of widespread literacy. Stories were told of ancestors, of local heroes, of mischievous spirits, or of humorous village happenings. Songs, often simple and repetitive, would be sung, echoing ancient tunes passed down through generations. This shared wisdom, these simple forms of entertainment, provided vital solace. They offered a temporary escape from the grim realities, fostering a sense of identity and continuity in a world where change was slow and life was fragile. These narratives and melodies were a form of shared resilience, connecting them to their past and subtly strengthening them for the future. Finally, as the last of the day's chores were done, and the flickering fire provided the only light, the profound exhaustion of the day's labor ensured that sleep came quickly. They would collapse onto their straw pallets, their bodies aching, their muscles screaming for relief. But even then, their dreams might be haunted by the anxieties of the next planting season. The desperate hope for a good harvest, or the constant, gnawing question of whether they would survive another year. The threat of famine, illness, or the Lord's wrath never fully left them, even in slumber. Yet despite this perpetual struggle, despite the relentless demands and ever-present dangers, the medieval peasant lived a life of quiet dignity and enduring struggle against overwhelming odds. Their days were a testament to their unshakable connection to the land and their community, all forged in the crucible of ceaseless survival. Their willingness to face each dawn, knowing the arduous work and profound uncertainty it brought, was a powerful declaration of their unyielding spirit. Each night they returned to their humble homes. It was a hard-won victory, a silent but profound declaration that they had, against all the forces arrayed against them, endured. As the last echoes of the peasant's day fade into the silent annals of history, we are left with a profound understanding of lives lived with an intensity almost unimaginable to us today. Their story is a testament to unceasing hard work, a deep-seated reliance on community, an unwavering faith that grounded them in a chaotic world, and an extraordinary resilience that allowed them to face unimaginable hardships. Their existence was a cyclical dance with the seasons, a relentless rhythm of labor, occasional celebration, and constant pervasive struggle. Above all, their lives were defined by an elemental, unyielding struggle for survival. Every dawn brought a new challenge, every sunset a fragile victory. From the cold, damp fields of medieval Europe, where wooden plows scarred the earth, to the sun-drenched rice paddies of Asia, meticulously cultivated through sheer human will, and every agricultural society in between, the daily rhythms of peasant life shared profound, undeniable similarities. The universal struggle against an unpredictable nature, the unbreakable bond of community forged in shared toil, the comfort derived from belief in a higher power or ancient spirits, and the sheer, unyielding grit required for survival against all odds, were not confined by geography or culture. While the names of their lords, their gods, or their staple crops might have differed, the fundamental human experience of living at the earth's mercy, building civilizations from the very soil, and striving every single day just to survive, was a shared, enduring legacy. Their ingenuity, their perseverance, and their ability to endure hardship laid the groundwork for future prosperity. These unseen lives, often defined by their very struggle to merely exist, shape the world we know today in countless fundamental ways. They perfected agricultural techniques, developed staple crops, and established the foundational structures of village life that would evolve into our towns and cities. Their immense collective labor produced the food and resources that allowed societies to grow, kings to reign, and armies to march. Without their ceaseless toil, the knights, the castles, the cathedrals, and the burgeoning trade routes of the medieval era simply could not have existed. They were the silent, unacknowledged bedrock upon which entire civilizations were built, their legacy etched not in monuments, but in the very land they worked, and in the enduring spirit of human resilience. Despite the vast chasm of time and experience that separates us from them, their fundamental human experiences transcend centuries. The love they felt for their families, the fear that gnawed at them, especially the fear of not surviving another winter, the glimmer of hope they clung to with each spring planting, the simple joys found in a communal feast, and the profound sorrow felt at the loss of a child or neighbor. These emotions are timeless, universal expressions of the human condition. Their story is a powerful, humbling reminder of humanity's enduring capacity for resilience, for courage, and for unyielding determination, even when existence itself is a daily, exhausting battle against overwhelming forces. They taught us, through their silent lives, what it truly means to endure. Let the story of the medieval peasant prompt us to reflect on our own lives today. We often take for granted the abundance, the comfort, and the security that they could only dream of. Their lives remind us that true richness often lies not in material possessions, but in perseverance, in the strength of community bonds, and in an unshakable connection to the very earth beneath our feet. For them, that connection was not a philosophical concept or a recreational pursuit. It was the raw, undeniable difference between life and death. It was the absolute imperative of survival. The peasants' unwavering spirit, their quiet dignity in the face of relentless hardship, and their profound resilience serve as an enduring inspiration. Their story, though often overlooked, resonates with an eternal truth. The human spirit, when pushed to its limits, possesses an incredible capacity not just to survive, but to truly live, to find meaning, and to lay the groundwork for futures they could never have imagined.